Welcome to the Hustle and Flow podcast,
a platform we use to explore varying perspectives and opinion through candid conversation.
We chat about philosophy, business, and all things life. I'm Shaun the Hustle.
And I'm Les the Flow.
Let's go.
All right, guys. Today's guest joining us today is Doug Wilson. Doug's incredible story is truly one of the journey from tragedy to triumph. In 2013, he was diagnosed with a life-threatening brain tumour, and he endured a 14-hour surgery, which led to an extensive cranial nerve damage, meningitis, and he left the hospital in a wheelchair. Just over a year later, he set a Guinness World Record by becoming the first person to run 7 competitive marathons on 7 different continents in under 7 days. Doug is also the author of Kundalini Running, his memoir, where he shares the story of his struggles with drugs and alcohol addiction, mental illness, and physical disability, as well as the extraordinary journey of healing that helped him to turn his life around. So, with great pleasure, welcome, Doug.
Morning, guys. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, mate.
Absolute pleasure to have you here, Doug. And Les has just given us some very brief cliff notes about what sounds like an amazing journey, mate. So I'd like to open the floor up to you and find out more about your origin story, Doug, and how you've come to be where you are today. And please fill us in.
Yeah, it's a pretty big story that can go in a lot of different directions, but the starting point for it was growing up in Melbourne, Australia. So just growing up, pretty normal life, pretty normal upbringing, all of that sort of thing. Didn't get a lot of direction in my younger life. Finished year 12 after high school. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Spent a few years kind of doing bits and pieces, little odd jobs here and there, but again, never really having a clear-cut direction in my life. And I think a lot of that kind of led into using like drugs and alcohol from quite an early age, always kind of not feeling quite right within myself, but it was something that had always kind of been present from me from going through school until I finished. And I got to a few years after finishing high school, and I think that kind of got to me, started getting to me, and I couldn't see a way out of how my life had been up until that point. And yeah, I kept going through these pretty vicious cycles of knowing I wanted to do something different with my life and not quite knowing what it was, and knowing that I had to change kind of the patterns of behavior that I'd cultivated, like from my younger years coming into this phase of life. And yeah, my bright idea was to run away from it all. At the early 20s, I thought I'd throw everything into a suitcase and ship myself off to the other side of the world. Not really knowing what I would be doing. My idea was go and work in London for 6 months, save some money, then go and travel for 6 months, and somehow that would kind of solve all my problems. That was my way of thinking anyway. And it turns out when I got over to London, I actually did, in a sense, start to find a bit of direction. I got into a really cool job over there, working in the financial services sector, investment banking for quite a large investment bank, but on the enterprise IT side of things. So lucky to just get into that without any extra tertiary qualifications or anything like that. Just sort of got in at the ground floor at a really good time when tech was taking off. I think this was about 2005. Tech was starting to go through its really fast, rapid growth, and just learn from the ground up and learn a lot about server technology and how computers all hang together, and yeah, just a lot about global markets and things like that. And went from being like an on-site tech support type of role, working there for almost 8-9 years, getting my way up into solution architecture, IT design, things like that. So I went on this really rapid career progression, and kind of tied in with that was a pretty crazy lifestyle that started to happen. I started to earn a lot of money working in that industry, which was great, but I had always been living this kind of fast-paced lifestyle, and all the things with like drugs and alcohol had kind of stayed with me through these years. And getting into the investment banking industry, that stuff's kind of rife in London in those industries. So I just fell into this, even though I was successful on paper, earning money, doing things, traveling the world, working in London, working in New York by this stage, still had that underlying feeling that something wasn't quite right. And just living this 1,000,000 miles an hour. And then, that all stopped around about the time when I turned 30. I just started feeling a bit unwell one day in terms of getting vertigo and just feeling these spells of dizziness and stuff like that. And I tried to brush it all aside. I'm working these 10-hour days, traveling the world, all this sort of stuff. So I expected to maybe feel a little bit tired, but it progressively got worse. I started collapsing in the mornings, trying to get out of bed. All these kinds of odd things started happening to me. I started having cognitive trouble, and a bit of motor coordination was failing and things like that. And long story short, I ended up getting an MRI scan one Friday morning before work. And the result of that was a really massive brain tumor. It was a bit bigger than a golf ball, about 4.5 centimeters.
Wow.
So I didn't end up going to work that day. I ended up going back to my flat in London, chucking everything into a bag again and shipping myself back off to Melbourne. I got diagnosed Friday morning in London, and I was back in Melbourne in a neurosurgeon's office on the Monday. Finding out then sort of went through this rapid thing of finding out things were quite serious. Like the tumor was so big that the operation was going to be risky and all of these sorts of things. And I had to have all these pre-surgery checks done, and things like cerebral angiography and all these crazy sort of things just happened really quickly. My life had been turned upside down. And then from there, I went on quite a crazy journey. Went in for a 14-hour operation, which was pretty brutal. Came out of that and had suffered a lot of extensive nerve damage in my head. Cranial nerves got damaged. I ended up in the high dependency unit in the neurology ward, which is a bit like ICU, and was in there for a few days on quite unwell. And you hear these stories about people that have near-death experiences, and you hear about like tunnels and flashes of light and things like this. And I definitely had some of those experiences over those few days in there, but was lucky to pull through, and finally came out into the neurology ward, where I started to learn that I'd suffered a lot of damage to the nerves and lost my hearing, had facial paralysis. I'd lost the balance functionality on my right-hand side, so I was going to have to learn to walk again, and all these sorts of things that are pretty grim to deal with at the age of 30. And while I was trying to get over that, I contracted meningitis. While I was trying to get over the meningitis, I got a bad case of swine flu and ended up spending collectively it was about a month in hospital. A few times where I was pretty sick there. I didn't think I was going to make it. And that really rattled me in two ways. It was one, going through the trauma of an experience like that, but also now I'm being forced to slow down. I'd always lived life at this really fast pace, and this had forced me to slow down and face a lot of the things I'd been keeping myself busy or running away from since quite young. I just had a few crazy months after that. I was on a lot of medication, a lot of pharmaceutical medication, things for anti-anxiety, depression, PTSD was thrown in there, all these sorts of things. And I'm trying to learn to walk again. And just all this stuff's going on, and it wasn't easy to deal with. And my ideas running through my head was to get back to the life that I thought had been taken away from me. I needed to get back there as quick as possible. So I rushed my recovery, rushed myself back to London. And I think it was about 6 months later, I was sitting back at my desk in London and still sort of asking those questions that I've been asking my whole life, like, what am I doing? Where's this all going? What's the point of it all? And that was a bit of a big realization for me. And I finally put a bit more of a different vibration out to life, I guess you could term it that way. Sort of saying, I need help, but not so much a thought, not so much like a mental thought loop or anything like that, more of a feeling of really putting something quite different out. And from there, my life got crazy different really quickly. And this is where I could go into a heap of different tangents, but I'll try and keep it on track and not go for too long with this story. It's a long story.
Yeah, whatever you like, mate.
But the short version is, a few days later after that experience, I met this guy in the gym. I was like working on trying to get my strength back, and met this guy who was trying to, he was a personal trainer at the gym. He was trying to get me into personal training. It was the last thing that I wanted to do. Kept hassling me, and kind of our chat went off on this tangent, and he could see that I was not going to buy into the personal training side of things, and ended up talking about this other thing he did outside of the gym, which was energy healing, which is something that I'd never heard of before. I came from quite a scientific background working in the IT space, but I was quite interested in physics and quantum mechanics and things like that. So my view on energy was very clear cut, defined, scientific. He's going on about all this stuff about energy, but part of me was intrigued by what he was talking about. And a few days after that, I'm in his clinic in central London, down this little alleyway just off London Wall, around Liverpool Street. This alleyway I'd walked past, 1,000 times before. And just go in for this energy healing session, which was quite bizarre. Again, I didn't really know what I was getting into. And this guy just did this like energy healing on me. And it was quite a profound experience, something I'd never experienced before. And I came out of that feeling quite different. And that was a real big trigger point for me to take a big direction shift in my life. I came out of that and tried to go back to the office. I'd actually left my morning's work to go and have this healing session, and went back to the office feeling quite different, and just observing the behavior of my mind very differently from what had happened. And to compress the story again, the next few months after that were bizarre, unprecedented, very different experience of reality that I'd had up until that point in my life. And I kind of went through a big change in terms of breaking away from the patterns that I'd been sort of ingrained into my whole life. I started, barely going into the office. I was spending a lot of time just sitting in my room contemplating life. I ended up spending my time that I'd normally research IT things and stuff like that. I was looking into the more, I guess you could call them, spiritual aspects of life, looking into practices like Buddhism and Hinduism, and yoga and meditation kept coming at me. And a few months later, I ended up on this island in Greece at a yoga retreat. Again, something, these things, yoga and meditation, I'd heard those words before, but never really knew what they were. I had this incredible time on this island learning the practice of what's known as Kundalini yoga, which is more about, not so much along the things that we typically view yoga with, the stretching and flexibility aspects of it, the contemporary ideals of yoga. This is more about sitting down and shifting energy within the body. And that was quite appealing to me. And it, again, changed me quite a lot. I left the island feeling quite different. So much so that when I went back to London, I couldn't go back to work. I ended up quitting my job, and that was quite a big deal for me, because it'd been a career that I'd almost been building for, nearly 10 years. And it meant a lot to me. Like, that career actually meant quite a lot to me, and just to kind of throw it away and without really knowing what I was going to do was a huge deal. But I kind of took that leap into the unknown, so to speak. And then from there, compressing the story again, I really took to the yoga, changed my diet, just changed the way I was living. I'd been kind of running before I got sick. It was all thrown into the mix of my crazy way of life. I'd done marathons, but I used to do them more of a sense to go to cool parts of the world and run in places I wouldn't necessarily visit. So I'd done things like run marathons in Antarctica and places like Greenland and like across frozen lakes in Siberia and stuff like that. But I got back into the running and got super fit, kept up with the yoga, and then it was only about 12 months after I'd been pushed out of hospital in a wheelchair, I ended up doing this crazy race, which was to run 7 marathons on 7 continents and to try and do it in under 7 days. And managed to do that, managed to be the first across the line where it finished in Sydney. I did 6 days and 18 hours, which ended up being a Guinness World Record. And from there, I really stepped back and saw, wow, look what I've been able to achieve from taking up this yoga and meditation. I really wanted to see how far I could take that. And I went really deep into the practice, learnt more about it, and really was quite disciplined with that, practicing every day. Didn't miss a day for almost 4 years, and in that time became quite a good adventure marathon runner. I won a lot of crazy races around the world and did quite well, and stayed with my practice. Ended up getting into the teaching side of things, teaching yoga and meditation. Ended up working in the drug rehabilitation space a little bit. That kind of brings us up to up to this point in time. So I know that's the shortest way I can tell it. It's quite a long story, and there's a lot of different tangents. So I'll leave it open to you guys to see if there's any parts of that you want to pick apart.
There's so much. There's so much that I want to follow, mate. Amazing story, and thank you for sharing. Super inspirational. And the thing that I think about when you're telling that story, I really resonate with a lot of it, because as our listeners will know, like my story is very similar to yours, in that I spent about 12 years in corporate, in also in the financial services space, and also in IT project space as well, just like you, mate. And in 2013, I was diagnosed with cancer, which was my trigger point to ultimately leave. And I also went down a very spiritual path, and now I am also a meditation teacher as well, and delve in that realm. And I want to talk to you more about these moments you had where you were talking about these feelings of not belonging, or there was something more. What were they like? And what exactly were the triggers that spurred you on to follow those more intuitive callings down something that you couldn't possibly intellect or articulate for yourself?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the way to define it there is exactly that. It's about understanding the feeling versus the thought. So I'd been caught up in my whole life in just identifying with my thoughts, purely self-identification through the thought process, that ongoing loop that just never stopped. And I can go back to telling, like, the defining point. There was an actual defining point for me where that changed in my life. I always had a feeling something wasn't quite right, but it would then be the way that I would think about it. And you always can just go off on tangents and tell yourself to think a different way, and you're just constantly sort of doing this. Well, that's how I was my whole life, just constantly bouncing between my thoughts and trying to ignore my feelings.
Absolutely.
Or not being able to kind of consolidate the two. But it was after that energy healing session, the guy, he was, I came out of that wanting him to give me like facts and figures about what he'd just done. I'd wanted statistics. How did he make me feel that way? How did he make all these crazy things that I experienced in this lucid state happen just by putting his hands on the back of my head? And I'm asking all these questions, and he's just sort of sitting there going like, divine energy, brother, and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, what do you mean? And anyway, he just, as we were wrapping up that conversation and I was about to go back to the office, he said something so simple to me, but it was very profound. He just said to me, he goes, don't go back and just rush into your day and get everything. He goes, be aware and pay attention to your thoughts. And I kind of went, like, something just clicked in that moment. He's like, pay attention to my thoughts. Like, something so simple. And I was at this stage like 31, 32 or something like that, but nobody had ever said that to me in my life. Something so simple. And that was just a trigger for me, that when I did get back to my office, I kept sort of, pay attention to my thoughts. And I didn't realize that there was part of me that could kind of sit back and look up and observe what's happening in the behavior of my mind. And that really actually was just a trigger point into me. I started meditating then. So without even knowing what it was or having any kind of lesson in it or anything like that, that moment after that energy healing, just knowing that simple little thing, I'd already started then becoming more into that meditative state, or practicing something that will lead to meditation. And yeah, sitting there and just going through that observation. That's why I said that I compressed the story there, but there was this 2 or 3 month period and it's a really difficult thing to talk about because it was so bizarre and so profound, and the things that happened through that period of time, if I talked about a lot of them, I would sound crazy, you know. But I'm like going through these periods of time where I'm very aware and very present throughout the days, but my days are going like they're just going so fast. Like the days and nights are just going, and I'm just sitting in my room a lot of the time, like looking out this window, looking out over this garden. I would go into the office, but really weird, like fleeting periods of time. I'd go in there, I'd sit there for an hour. I wouldn't feel like I could be there. And then I'd go and wander the streets of London. I'd sit in gardens and I'd just sit there and contemplate things. And just, I don't know, it was really, really bizarre things happening. And I had some very, not crazy experience, but really profound experiences that were then quite similar to the death or the near-death experience that I had in ICU, like again, going into different realms of perception and seeing things that to me were not anything like hallucinations. They were very real, and experiencing them in the same way that I experienced this reality. So yeah, just these profound things, and just doing that made me realize that there was something more, obviously, to the physical aspects of existence, which I think everybody knows. Like everybody knows this to an extent. It's how much you want to delve into that and investigate that, and how much awareness you want to kind of bring to those other aspects of life. Yeah, so I think it was just, you get moments in life, everybody gets, and they're always different. You can never predict where they're going to happen, but they're little opportunities where you can kind of go different ways, and it's always going to be based on like your awareness to those opportunities. And to me, yeah, there was a few very specific points along the way that just made me turn a little bit more inwards, away from the chatter of the mind, to just a little bit more of a like balanced understanding about my existence. And I think the whole, I don't even like calling it a trick to life, but the whole thing to life is just being aware of what your relationship to that is, and it's different for everybody. So I don't think that there's a silver bullet to give any sort of wisdom or, you know, one size fits all. It's all about like awareness to who I was as an individual and where I sat within like this point of existence. And yeah, I think that's an ongoing process. I am by no means think that I'm at the end of that now at all. You know, even after all I've been through, I feel like it's all just still constant learning, and I wouldn't want to put a cap on that, because why would I? Why would I want to stop learning about existence?
Of course.
With you 100% with everything you just said, man. Like, you know, it's even that that common misconception in collective society about what meditation is, you know, and you mentioned it yourself in terms of being able to delve down or into or hold meditative states without actually, you know, consciously practicing, you know, sitting in the lotus position, you know, with your hands in your lap and not chanting Om or whatever it is, right? There is a very fine difference between the conscious practice and also being able to, you know, enter into a meditative state, you know, in every waking moment of life. You know, it is about that awareness, and it's beautiful the way you sort of describe these profound moments that you had, or circumstances you had that you felt were difficult to talk about, because, you know, to me, like I myself have had similar experiences as well throughout my own journey, and the way that I described it is that when you're in deep presence, then it's like a state of timelessness, right? It's that there is no linear like concept of time. You just experience what's in front of you, or within you, or surrounding you, right? And it is a beautifully profound experience for yourself. And I think that in itself, like you said, is the silver bullet, if there is any. Like, generally speaking, right? It's just about presence, and then whatever you derive from that is what it is for you. You know?
Yeah. But to me, that's just that idea of presence is just a fundamental force of nature that everybody has access to, but everybody will have a different relationship to.
Yeah. For sure. And I think the people trying to intellectualize everything is this is what's holding people back a lot of times. And from my own experience, that's what it's been for me. And mate, when you said you had this moment where the energy healer told you to just pay attention to your thoughts, it just took me back, mate. Personally, I had this moment. I was listening to a podcast, and someone on the podcast said exactly that. They were like, it was one of those throwaway questions at the end of a podcast that someone asked the guest, and they were like, "Oh, if there's one thing we haven't talked about that you could share with people that you wanted to, and we didn't talk about, what would it be?" And he said, "It's just to tell people to observe their thoughts and to know that you are the observer. Like, your thoughts are happening, but they're not you."
Yeah.
Right?
It's something that's so simple, but unless you actually get told that, and we don't get in kind of Western culture, we don't get anything like that growing up. It's just almost the complete opposite.
That's right.
Work hard, just keep going, sort of thing. Like these kind of things, like just do almost like, I don't think it's evil in any way. It's just kind of like how it evolves, right? But it's kind of like just do well and just keep going, sort of thing is what we're told. We're never really told to stop, slow down, take stock, and I think that simple thing like can help a lot of people. But then it's then what you do with it. It can also, I think, go the other way with people, because sometimes people slow down and realize that their thoughts are quite disturbed as well. And that can send, and this is another fine balancing point that I think we need to find within humanity about these practices is going back to like the old traditions and where they've, studied this for thousands of years. There was always a way of getting to these points and certain places with the mind and awareness and all these sort of things. But the body and the mind needs to be also in a certain state of purity as well, because otherwise some people don't want to become aware of their thoughts and how like messed up their thoughts or how, damaging their thoughts might be to themselves, sort of thing. So it's again, still trying to find a balance for people with that as well. But yeah, I think this whole thing with yoga and meditation in the culture now, it's almost been like productionized.
Yeah.
Turned into this thing through social media, and now everybody's kind of like, doing it because there's money and it's such a big industry, and we diluted the essence of and the simplicity of it and all these sorts of things. And I think I'm hoping it's just a moment of time for humanity and we go back to a bit more of the simplicity with it soon.
Yeah. It's kind of like, I feel like that's happened with a lot of, if you want to call them like quote unquote products over many years, like people realize there's power to things and that things work. And so there's always going to be people that jump on it and want to monetize it and benefit from it in some way. But then they kind of come back and have this, or they're going through a bit of a renaissance, and then people start to come back to the actual core essence of them. We've seen like in food for sure. It's like someone realized something tastes good and it had this beautiful artisan nature to it. And some people knew about it, and then it gets like mass produced and people are like, wait a minute, I don't think this is really how it's meant to be or how we're meant to be experiencing this. And then a sort of Puritan nature comes back to it. And I actually want to ask you a bit more about that. You just mentioned something then, you said there needs to be this purity of mind and body. Could you talk a bit more to that?
So in terms, those two things are inherently connected, right? Yeah. So the body and the mind are the same thing. They're just different forms of each other. So if you look, and most people would have, I think a lot of people would have heard like about the practices of yoga and meditation. You kind of have these ideals of these guys sitting in caves trying to reach enlightenment and all these sorts of things. But it's all a big misconception. See, it's been diluted, mistranslations all over time. And a lot of people think that the ideals of yoga and meditation are to reach this ultimate state of bliss. And once you become enlightened, all of your problems in life are going to be solved and all this sort of stuff. But it's not actually like that. You can become enlightened. You can understand what the backbone of creation is. But if you don't have the faculties to deal with that, it can be very dangerous. And it's well documented in a lot of, there's a lot of books that write about it. So the whole point about like trying to reach that point, they usually try to do it in a safe manner, which is done over long periods of time and not even necessarily in a single lifetime. It's about progressing towards a certain state. because if you reach that state of the ultimate knowing and you're a little bit disturbed, it will ultimately cause problems. So purifying the body and the mind, that's what the practices of yoga and meditation are more about, like the actual practices, like the techniques that you use to reach certain states. They're all about getting the body and the mind prepared for higher states of awareness. And again, in this quick fix culture that we live in now, everybody wants the end goal. Everybody wants the result and they want it yesterday. So we get these, and to me, I think a lot of the things with what we see on social media, these things you're saying, people trying to make a quick buck or do whatever, what we're just talking about, I think there can be a little bit of a detriment to that and can be a bit dangerous, because and that's why I don't tend to sort of do online courses and things like this, because I don't know who's going to pick that up. You know, like, I think we shouldn't lose the value of like personal contact and all these sort of things. And if you can go back to the example of yoga and meditation, these things are always done from masters to disciples. You know, like the masters would be 60, 70, 80 years old, and they'd be training the people, and everybody would go through their initiations. And, you know, it wasn't done on a, 28-day course. It was 30, 40 years of your life sort of thing. So again, not to discredit those things. I don't think anybody's out there doing those things maliciously. It's just the nature of the world that we live in right now. And everybody's, I'm well aware of the reality of nature. We've all got to make money to survive. And these are ways that are people making money. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think in the terms of people really searching for that thing within, there is a sense of purity. And that doesn't come about easily. And it's not something you can shortcut either. It's definitely not something that can be shortcutted. Yeah.
I mean, it's one of these things that I like to quote a lot, and it's by Dr. Martin Shaw, and he says, "Be wary of the short route," because a lot of the time that's one of those things that isn't going to yield you, if ever, anything that is going to have a lasting, benefit for you as a person. And when you talk about, these states of enlightenment, it's certainly, to me, in the general sense of the understanding, it has been, misconceived as a state to be arrived at, because for me, like, Zen Buddhism is my doctrine of study, and they describe enlightenment not as a state of arrival, but it's a moment. It's simply a moment. You can click your fingers and you can feel a state of enlightenment that is brief, and it's fleeting. But then if you are not practicing on a consistent and disciplined and dedicated basis going forward, then it is just going to drift away from you.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of speaks to this practicing the art of practice. It's a humble pursuit of something that is very likely unattainable in its whole entirety. So again, it's sort of very sort of converse to how the general Western society thinks and feels and wants. They just desire to grasp something and hold something very tangible and just keep it, and just keep it in their grasp.
Yeah. And again, it gets marketing that it's that thing. You hear all these words thrown around with it, like blissful state and eternal happiness and all these sorts of things. And it's all misquoted, misconceptions and mistranslation of text. It's, Chinese whispered all the way down sort of thing, We hear these things. And I think in this day and age, with the way that the world is, it would be quite hard to achieve those states because we are so distracted. We're so far removed from that way now that I don't think there's much opportunity for people now to take the time and to get there. But again, not to say that we shouldn't sort of start moving back towards that, but everything goes in swings and seasons, right? So absolutely, we can say that those things were happening 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. We went down into this descent. You talk about like seasons, the Earth moving around the sun's also moving around the Milky Way. So we're going through these like periods of time. And I think humanity's at a dip, like we're at the trough of something right now. And maybe we will come into another period of renaissance and come back out working more back towards these things and coming back into another evolved period of human enlightenment. Again, there's never going to be a cap on it. it's so pointless to say that existence is right. You reach this point and that's it. You're done. That would defeat the purpose of life. So it's just, to me, like and this is like going off on a bit of a tangent here, but we are right in this shift. If you look at age of the Piscean age to the Aquarian age, and if you look at it from, we're moving into a new technical revolution and all that sort of stuff. Now, I feel like exactly what's happening right now with humanity, we're into the bottom of the trough. Like what we're going through, coronavirus, all these sorts of things is going to take us right down. And then that'll give us the opportunity to kind of have this like tail out, and where humanity goes from there will be really interesting. But yeah, I think that these people that are around now that have the means to help people with meditation and these sort of practices, they're going to be super valuable to humanity moving forward. We can already see that now. People's mental health is being stretched to the limit. I think coronavirus is only going to amplify this, and all these sorts of things. So there's going to be a period where we have to all heal from even this experience, like not even just this experience, but all the crazy things that have been happening in humanity and the way it's being kind of presented through media and stuff like that now. Like there's going to be a lot of healing that needs to come of that. And I think that's going to be we're going to get to that point where that has to start happening soon, or we're going to descend into complete chaos.
And I think that's such a poignant point to like sort of continue to follow on and like you really highlight in this conversation, right? And I think that whether you reflect back, on each of our individual experiences as people or collectively, right? And if we ignore these problems that continue to sort of arise and ask the question, if we continue to ignore those questions, what happens? Essentially, something pulls the rug from underneath us, and then we have to rebuild from there. That's really the wake-up call, whether it was, whatever traumas each of us as individuals have endured through our lives. I would say it's the same thing for my cancer. I ignored all these feelings until it came to the point where I needed to, get treated for cancer, and then woke up and, changed my perspective on life, really, right? But like you were saying, with everything that's going on, coronavirus, all the racial tension in the States and across the globe, this is the rug being pulled from underneath everyone's feet, and if we aren't prepared, in the way that you're speaking of, just being mentally, spiritually, bodily aligned and prepared to move through this period of time in history, then it's going to be very tough for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, like you hit the nail on the head there, if we don't also learn the lessons and start to do something about it, like it's the same thing. You see a lot of people that it sort of came out, this whole pandemic started, and people had that perception, oh, this is an inconvenience. Like, 2 months kind of passed by. I'm glad that's over. That was such an inconvenience, like, oh, we can just go back to the way everything was. And it's like, nah, humanity needs to learn a lesson that we were on. It's the trajectory that we went on was too rapid. It just wasn't sustainable, and now we're getting shown like things like it's very representative. Slow down, don't. All these things we're being kind of forced to do now, it's very representative of what we need to change. And hopefully people do learn that lesson on a whole, more togetherness, more sustainable ways of living, not realizing that, just chasing money and all these kind of things like, economic growth and all these sorts of things is ultimately not what's going to keep people alive and the planet healthy and all these sorts of things. So it really is. Yeah, it's the same thing. You just extrapolate it out. What happens for an individual, those laws for an individual are consistent for a collective, and that's universal.
Absolutely. And sorry, go on, Shaun.
Oh, good. There's one thing that's been coming up which is people keep trying to get to somewhere, like to the end, right? And you mentioned earlier, like, you don't ever want there to be a cap on your experience. And this is something Les has spoken to me about on a number of occasions, well before we started this podcast, but it just keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. And I was always someone who just kept trying to get somewhere. And then somewhere along the line, it shifted for me. And it's like, you really do realize that that cliche of it's not the destination, it's the journey is where it's at. And I think it's because, and I'd love your opinion on this. It's like, I don't think we stop to realize that it's always progress and then a depress. There's always expansion and contraction, and it's always happening. And there's never like just that end. But everybody's, I think, because we just are taught to be like, through all these different mechanisms of our life of like school, and whether you buy a house and then that's it, or you get married and then you have a kid, and like that's the thing that people are trying to work towards, and then they get to it. But like there's always stuff after that. Like after you finish school, there's something to do, mate. After you get married, you've got your whole marriage and relationship ahead of you. Once you have a kid, you've got to raise the child and nurture them through life.
Yeah, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with wanting to achieve and reach goals and all that. We shouldn't sort of say that don't do that things, but it's kind of like that sense that don't think like, I can even talk from myself, like when I was kind of, say back when I was doing my running before I got sick, it was always like this kind of idea of like, oh, if I do this race and I do this well, like then I'll be happy, you know, like then like, so it's kind of like these kind of like little points that I'm kind of working towards. And it happened to me when I ran my race. This is before I did the 7 continents, before my brain tumor. I'd been working on, I'd actually run on the 7 continents before that, but I'd done that over like a 3-year period. I went and did like kind of races around the world. But that whole 3 years, I was kind of like always in my mind, oh, I've got to get to this 7th continent. And like, when I do that, like that'll be the goal. And then I'll feel complete, or, you know, and always have that kind of bartering with myself or with existence, however you want to phrase it, sort of saying like, oh, when I get that, I'll stop asking for things. And like, I'll just like, it'll just be like this end. And then you get there and you cross the line in Antarctica, I throw my hands up in the air, but 10 minutes later, I'm, oh shit, what do I do now? And you just start that whole process again. So I think it's like important to go like, you know, I don't know what the ultimate outcome of anything's going to be, but here are my targets. And when I get that, then I'll be more realistic. I'll reevaluate after that's happened, then decide what I want to do next. Don't ever sort of have this idea that like, oh, if I get that, that's it. I'll stop asking for things, because it's not wrong to want things out of life. We're here for a reason, right? So we should enjoy the things that we want to do. And it's just like, I think the only other caveat to put on that is the things that we do or that are more wholesome and towards, you know, this is where it all comes back to like, if they help the collective good or something move forward, then those things will keep coming towards you and life will run quite smoothly.
Yeah. And man, I resonate with what you just explained so much. And it's like this whole, if this, then that, if this, then that. And like you said, there's nothing wrong with having goals and wanting to achieve things. But that whole feeling of, once I do that, I'll be happy and that'll be it.
Yeah, I'll just stop.
Yeah, like you said, you cross that line in Antarctica, you threw your hands up, and then just 10 minutes later, you're like, and now? And if anyone stops to think about that and you've had something you've achieved, you're going to realize you've had that moment right after. Whether it's 10 minutes or half an hour or the next day when you woke up, you're like, oh, and now what? Like it keeps going. And that's beautiful. It's beautiful because there's so many other things we can do and achieve. Mm-hmm. And one thing that you mentioned as well is, you know, on part of your journey to where you are now is the discipline of your practice. And I think there's definitely something to that a lot of people who aren't familiar with just taking time to be still, or that don't have a meditative practice or anything that actually they use to try and, you know, be present, don't realize is that like discipline's a big part of it.
I think discipline's like a big part of life in general, and it doesn't necessarily need to be related to what you would sort of deem a meditation or a yoga practice or anything like this. Discipline and routine is super helpful, you know? It's something that keeps us on track, and it ties into working with goals and things like that, because the more consistent we are with things, the more we can see like the subtle changes in stuff. Like if we're really just working towards things and staying on like quite a linear trajectory, I think it's really beneficial. It's these times in life for myself where you're sort of going here, there, and everywhere, and you're kind of unsure, and you're trying little different things to try and find your way. But when you actually get onto a certain path that's quite a lot more clear cut, I think then developing routine around that and being like really consistent is helpful. But discipline's quite hard to cultivate in an undisciplined world. Like we live in a very, very undisciplined world. So there's a lot of things that don't help us towards that discipline. And when I went through my really big stretch of like living like a yogi, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, doing all these like practices of sadhana, like daily, which is literally daily routine, I found it really hard to kind of relate to a lot of the people that I was hanging around with because they weren't doing it. So that somebody would invite me to dinner, and I'd be like, oh yeah, where and when? They'd say 8 p.m. in the city, and I'd be like, that's way too late. I'm getting up at 4 a.m. sort of thing. I've got to do my training, and I felt like quite of an outcast because of that. So it's very easy to get just drawn back into the norm and the things that kind of take you away from what you're trying to achieve. And it's just something that needs to be overcome by an individual. There's no shortcut or quick fix around that. The only thing you can do is like consistency, day by day, work on the discipline, stay focused on the goal. And I don't think there's any other magic to it other than that, than just keep trying and like overcome each challenge. Every time you overcome one, it'll get easier each time. And I think there's kind of a tipping point with discipline where it ends up becoming quite ingrained, and it should become enjoyable. Like having self-discipline should actually become an enjoyable thing when you start to see the benefits of what it can bring. But again, it's not something that happens overnight. It can take years to cultivate that.
And I think with the thing with goal setting and even the enjoyment that you're speaking of, a really important part of it, and you mentioned this before, is that it should come from a place of purity and truth. When we're talking about the generic goals that a lot of people strive toward, and a lot of people listening could resonate with this, is that you get you get the job that you want, you get the car that you want, you get the girl or the guy that you want, the relationship that you want. But these things, if they're not coming, if the desires aren't coming from a pure place, then you're going to be left empty. Like you said, there's got to be some real almost a divine sort of direction for what you're sort of wanting in life, and that's what you're saying. It's different for everyone, but we only can find that once we sort of give ourselves a little bit of space and be still, and really listen to what that is for ourselves, for each of us, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just understanding the reasons why you're doing things, and whatever you put into what you're doing, it's the intention behind it.
Absolutely.
But understanding intent, again, has to come from that point of stillness. You have to sort of know, again, not what am I thinking, what do I want? It's what is the intention behind my thoughts, and what am I actually turning my projection to? Because ultimately that's what's going to return the result of what comes back to you. So yeah, anything not done from a state of purity, and again, not purity based on what anybody else thinks, purity based on what is actually pure and true to the individual. It's a super hard thing because we always conceptualize it as it should be like what's right and wrong for me should be right and wrong for everybody else, but that's completely false.
Yeah. Well, I think we talk about this a lot. The perception and of right and wrong is purely subjective to each and every individual. So.
And hoping that everybody else thinks that what you think is right, and what you think is wrong is. Man.
Yeah, then that's why when you come across somebody that disagrees with you, it's like, oh, I can't believe this person. And I think social media is just the epitome of that. You know what I mean? You see these like memes and posts, we're all in this together, until we disagree on social media.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's a crazy, crazy thing. And it's you see it play out time and time again on almost every post.
Yeah, you're right. And Doug, I just want to draw our attention to something which is, so our podcast is the Hustle and Flow podcast, and I think a lot of things associated with those terms are related to speed. So when people think about flow, they think about being in the zone, time slowing down, really being in tune. And then when people think about the hustle, it's like fast, go, 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 get things done. But the more we delve into these concepts, realize, there's a symbiosis between them, right? And to be able to hustle, you need to be able to flow, and vice versa. And there's one thing I've noticed from your journey and what you've shared with us today is you've actually done things really fast, man. And it sounds to me like, and I'd love for you to explain how you feel about it, seems like slowing down helped you to speed up and get close to where you feel you want to be. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, well, I've always lived life a million miles an hour, and through slowing down, I just realized that my perception of time was like frantic in my mind. Like time was always just happening, like at a kind of steady rate, and it wasn't so much. I think it was more that concept of like slowing down. It made me realize that I was never really as busy as I thought I was, or that time, like I had this concept, time was always running out. But I think from slowing down, I realized that, well, no, time's not the issue. It's just, I don't know how much time I have left. So it shouldn't be like a factor into things. It's just more that getting that realization that, I don't have to cram all these things into 70 years of life or 80 years of life. It's just like, no, I need to focus on what I need to do now, and then I guess that broke down like all those patterns of behavior, like I'm too busy to do this, and just learn, okay, what do I need to focus on? And once you're focusing on the things you need to do, you're more focused on them. You're not so much thinking about time. So you don't have this concept of like time is running out. You know what I mean? It's that subconscious thing for people, like time is running out. I need to get all this stuff done in 80 years of life. And my time's running out. But if you break that down, you just don't, you can then just focus on what you need to do. And that's a huge difference.
And it's such a paradoxical paradigm of thought, this element of time. And I always talk about this as well in the podcast, and that, it's paradoxical that we, in order to, get quote unquote quicker to where we innately want to go or be, and that's just our sense of purity or home or truth or whatever you want to call it, we need to slow down, and we really need to essentially just be, in every present moment, because like you said, this concept of the past or even the future and projection out, to the future or projection back in the past, these things are just, conceptions of the mind. What there really is just what is right in front of us, the moment that we're living right now, and that's all there really is to life, isn't there? And if we get caught up in one or the other or anything else in these mental projections, then in essence we are, quote unquote, wasting our time. Yeah.
If we're too caught up in the thoughts of what may or may not be, and it sort of ties back to that, like expecting things to happen in like these kind of linear ways, and trying to just always like almost live life through the thoughts, and think,
Totally.
As soon as we learn to break that down, it changes the concepts of everything in the way that we see everything.
I think there's a lot to that, man. Something you just said, which is like we try to live life based on the thoughts, like live life through our thoughts instead of actually experiencing it.
And that's not to say we shouldn't sit down and plan and,
of course,
might make timelines about the future. It's just, but to be realizing that even having those thoughts, you're having those thoughts in that moment of time.
Yeah.
I'm not just being like, I always used to think, like, before I got sick, because my life had been very linear and nothing had really sort of changed in it. Like, I'd mapped it all out, I'm going to work for this many more years. I'm going to earn this much money. I'm going to go and buy this house and then I'm going to be 70 and I'm 80, I'm going to die. I'd always just thought that's just how it would go, until I got, knocked off that way of thinking.
Yeah. And I think it's a very common theme for a lot of people who, experience these, catalyzing periods or situations in their life. They come to that realization that this sort of linear existence that we've all been sold is really just like an illusion. It's a myth, you know. And once you step off it, you know, we are able to actually, you know, pave our own paths. And like the way that I like to describe it, really, it's a path that we walk that is essentially pathless, because we don't know where it's going, but it's the truth, and we sort of and we're intuited toward and on this path, to stay on this path. And it's like, it's not an easy path to walk in any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, you know, ease and toughness is also a subjective thing for us to, you know, each perceive through our own eyes.
I think it's an interesting thing, and I don't want to go off. I know we're getting close to time, but I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent. But we have this perception in life that, you know, we should avoid pain, we should avoid suffering, we should only have happiness, we should only have pleasure. But for me, from my own experience, I've learned the most through suffering. You know, like the times when I was like laying in a hospital bed and wishing that I had died or something like this, and getting through those moments and overcoming real hardship and learning actually what hardship is and what a really tough time actually is. There's so much growth that comes from that. So if you look at it from the yogic perspective, we're not trying to say like, don't like just strive for happiness and avoid sadness. We're saying be aware of both and the value that both can bring. Positivity and negativity are both attributes of life, and we need both. And it's about trying to travel through the middle of those and being aware of either side. And then, because sometimes you need to use like something negative to help you move forward, and sometimes you use the positive things to help you come along. So it's not about trying to avoid one or the other, or, you know, again, live in this like ultimate blissful state permanently. It's about using both forces of nature and being in the balance of the two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this, you know, the classic, you know, yin yang symbol is like a beautiful, you know, representation, a holistic representation of what life is. You know, it's not, you know, really, you know, one or the other. You know, it's always both, and it's how it harmonically comes together in this beautiful union, and that's what really life is about. You know, in essence. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. All right. I think that's a really beautiful point for us to leave the conversation at, and for people to sort of ponder on. But again, thanks so much for joining us today, Doug. You know, really inspiring story, and you know, if we there's so many threads that I could have followed down as well. So you know, so many nuggets that I personally picked up as well, and I resonate with your story deeply. So again, I honor you for that, mate, and your path. I'd love to give you the floor to just see, you know, where people can find you, mate.
Yeah, at the moment, I've just got my kind of, I guess, personal branding under Kundalini Running. So social media, Kundalini Running, that's the title of my book. So I've got my own website and stuff like that. That's the only place that my book's available through. At the moment, not able to do too much with teaching because I like to teach in person and things like that. So yeah, not a lot going on there, but hopefully again soon, and be back teaching in studios around Melbourne and running workshops and stuff like that in the near future when things come back into a bit more of a normal state, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, man. And I will put all those details in the show notes there for you, mate. So.
All right, nice one.
All right, and Shaun, where can people find you, mate?
Yeah, easiest place to find me is just on Instagram, guys. So it's Shaun_Coop. So SHAUN_COOP. Just, you can send me a message there and we can interact on there. And how about you, Les?
Yeah, you can find me through my website, findingspace.co, and also on socials, Facebook and Instagram, it's just at findingspace.co. You can also reach Shaun and I through our email address here. If you've got any questions about this particular episode, if you want to reach out to Doug, or if you want to be a guest on the show as well, it's the Hustle and Flow podcast at gmail.com.
And Doug, just want to thank you again for coming on today and sharing your time with us. There's so many more things that I would love to discuss with you. I think we're going to have you back on.
Yeah, no worries.
And
let me know, guys. Happy to do it.
Thanks, mate. Thank you. I'm looking forward to that already.
All right. Nice one, guys.
And for those of you listening, you took something away from today, just a humble request, please just share it with one other person. I'm definitely going to be rewinding this and pondering and ruminating on some of the things you've shared today, Doug. And I'm sure there'll be things in here that resonate with other people too. And if you think there's something that can help someone else in your life, please just share it out with one other person. That's how we grow the podcast and want to get into the ears of other people so they can take things away from these conversations too. So until next time, guys, thanks a lot.
See you guys.